So, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Dr. Kalisa. I'm a lecturer at the University of Rwanda and a research fellow at the Center of Excellence in Biodiversity and Natural Resources Management and the current postdoc at the University of Toronto. Today, it is a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker. And actually, this is my first time to introduce the speaker, so I'm really glad to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is going to talk about the climate change adaptation in Rwanda. And this is the subject in which we should all be deeply interested because it highlights climate mitigation efforts in Rwanda. As you know, recently, Rwanda was the first developed countries to submit its NDC proposal for 2020 with ambitious updates of both mitigation and adaptation. So in its NDC, Rwanda pledged to reduce 8% in greenhouse gases emission by 2030 under Paris Agreement. Therefore, this is an opportunity for us to understand different dimensions of climate change adaptation in Rwanda that have the potential to contribute to Rwanda's sustainable development pathway. Our speaker, although have a long history in the American West, she was a Fulbright specialist with us last year and gave 2 trainings, one on sustainable development and another on teaching in the School of Science at the University of Rwanda. She's currently a lecturer at the Columbia University in New York, and she holds a PhD in environmental policy from Colorado State University. In 2015, she served as Associate Director for the Yale Center on Environmental Law and Policy. Her research on climate change adaptation policy has recently focused on ongoing partnership with the University of Rwanda, and we hope to continue to collaborate with her. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Riza Dale.
Thank you so much for such a kind introduction. I assume everybody can hear me, and I'm going to share my screen. So let's see how that goes. Can everybody see this? Can somebody verbally tell me that you can see this?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah.
Huh. Let's see.
Did you choose your entire screen?
Yes.
And then you will click in the pop-up window in the middle of the screen.
My apologies. We did practice this. Let's see. Let's try again. Your entire screen. Here we go. Oh, I see. Can you see it now?
It's coming.
As you can see the screen that says climate adaptation?
I can't seem to see it.
Perfect. Yep. Terrific, thank you. I will get started. I can only see my presentation, so if there are problems or anything, I think somebody will have to speak up. I can't see any of the written boxes or anything while I'm presenting. In any event, thank you so much for hosting me, for having me here. I'm Lisa Dale. I'm based in New York City in the United States, and I study climate adaptation policy in Rwanda. And I do that work in really close partnership with the University of Rwanda and the Center of Excellence in Biodiversity and Natural Resource Management. So the presentation I will share developed but not yet conducted. because of the pandemic. So I had planned to be in Rwanda all summer this year for 2 or 3 months and had to cancel my plans. So I am presenting research that I hope to do next summer, but I have done a lot of work to develop it and build it. So I share with you my ideas and my research plans. So here's how we can start to think about this issue. When we think about climate change policy, we usually think about it in 2 different categories. The first is climate change mitigation. And the person who introduced me just now spoke about Rwanda's incredible progress on climate mitigation policy, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, slowing or reversing the pace of climate change. A lot of the work in NDCs, the contributions under the Paris Agreement, have to do with countries' plans to mitigate climate change. And Rwanda has been a leader in the African continent in this category. But the other half of the issue is adaptation. And this is very different from mitigation. These are policies or actions that are taken to respond to climate change that is already happening. So it is responding to a different set of challenges, and it is building resilience and planning for current and future impacts. My research is entirely in the adaptation side of this equation. There are some policies and actions that do both. We call those co-benefits. But I give you this information so you can begin to understand the difference between mitigation policy and adaptation policy, and my work is in that second category, adaptation. So adapting to what? What do we know about impacts from climate change? Here's a summary slide that reminds us, I think most people on this call have familiarity with the projected impacts of climate change. As we know, climate change already is affecting every sector of society: food, water, ecosystems, weather events, and irreversible change risk goes up as the global temperature rises. I show you this chart as a schematic, as a thematic way of thinking about the range of challenges that climate change presents to society and all of the different components that Rwanda will have to adapt to. So how can we think about that? Well, this is a slide that I'm sure is not necessary in this group. Most of the people on this call are in fact in Rwanda, but when I give this talk in the US, I have to spend a lot of time explaining where Rwanda is. So this slide just helps to situate us to where we are and the overview of the country. What are the important pieces of Rwanda's story that help us understand the context for climate adaptation? Well, of course, we know the 1994 genocide. And for the purposes of this talk, even more important is the robust recovery that the country has seen since Reconstruction after the genocide. In the decade that just ended, Rwanda had one of the fastest and highest growth rates on the continent and indeed in the world. So Rwanda is making tremendous strides in developing, in economic growth, and in creating opportunities for Rwandans. However, Rwanda still ranks near the bottom of the United Nations HDI, which is the Human Development Index. The HDI measures a range of different variables, including things like life expectancy, literacy rates, income, healthcare, and a number of others that define what the United Nations considers human development. Rwanda is still near the bottom. There are about 195 countries in the world, and so Rwanda is ranked 157th. So despite this robust economic recovery, Rwanda still faces significant challenges. The biggest challenge for Rwanda that is relevant for climate adaptation is that Most of Rwandans, 80%, are rural and they are smallholder farmers. Many of them also have large families, and many of them face a lifestyle without access to most modern services that we have here in the US and in some other parts of the world. These farmers, these families in rural areas, can be seen as quite vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So here's what I'm trying to study in these projects that I will describe to you. My first question is, how can we understand how climate change adaptation can support and maybe even strengthen sustainable development in Rwanda? In other words, the challenge is for Rwanda's growth to not be undermined by climate change impacts. That's happening all over the world. Countries that are seeing progress in some areas find that progress cut short when they have increasing storms, reduced yield from agriculture, and other impacts from climate change. So my first research question is, how can policies related to climate change adaptation support development in Rwanda? And my second question is related to this, which has to do with the scale of those policies. So national policies are often understood as what we call enabling policies, in the sense that they create a context for local governments and local residents to change their behavior to adapt better. So how can we understand how these enabling policies at the national level create incentives and motivation for local actors to help with Rwanda's sustainable development? So what I'm about to describe to you are 4 separate mini research projects. We can think of each one as a pilot project that tries to answer different dimensions of these questions. These 2 questions are really connected. I could have written them as one longer question. It's a little harder to understand. So thinking about it as 2 related questions is one way to set up this talk. And I'm now going to describe 4 different projects that we have built. Each project is created with a local partner. So I see some of my local partners on this call, and I really look forward to your feedback in particular. So these 4 projects have been built by me over the last couple of years during my visits to Rwanda and my time spent there, different components of thinking about climate adaptation. So I'm going to describe these 4 projects to you now. First, let me discuss the methods that I will use for this research. All of my research is qualitative. This is different than quantitative. And I know many of you who are studying the sciences at the University of Rwanda rely on quantitative methods. You measure things, you count things, and then you compare differences in those numbers. Qualitative methods are different, and they're quite common in the social sciences because they seek to understand human behavior. And the argument here for using qualitative methods is that social behavior is so complex that when we reduce it to numbers, we miss a lot. So I use qualitative methods. For example, ethnography, which means I have traveled to Rwanda, I have immersed myself to some degree in the experience of living there and meeting you and learning from Rwandans. I have conducted case studies, I have conducted many interviews. These methods contribute to knowledge and understanding. But my research is a specific type of qualitative method. I have built partnerships between the University of Rwanda and Columbia University, where I teach in the US. And this research that I'm going to describe to you will be carried out by teams of students from both universities working together to conduct this research. And this is really important for a few reasons. The first is that Columbia students, American students coming to Rwanda, have a really there. So the Rwandan students provide a real value for us as cultural and linguistic brokers. They can understand different languages, they speak Kinyarwanda, they can help translate cultural components of this for us. So the teams create this opportunity to learn. And this is an important part of this. The methods are not just standalone methods toward knowledge. The methods themselves are part of the research. So conducting research in this way, the ways that we know things, the ways that we conduct research by combining different cultural researchers is part of what we're doing. We are building capacity and learning together. Creating knowledge together is one of the outcomes of this research. Not just measuring things, but doing the work is a research product. This research is funded now through Columbia University's Global Scholars Program. We were underway with this program in the spring and we had to cancel it because of the pandemic. So it is my hope that we will be able to return to that program as soon as possible. Here are the 4 projects now that I am going to pursue. Project number 1 is a study of index-based crop insurance. So for each of these projects, I'll very briefly describe it. I will explain what the research questions are, what the issue is, and how it relates to adaptation. At the end of my talk, I really look forward to some questions. So if you have any questions, please jot them down, and when we're finished, you can ask them. So the idea of insurance in general is to transfer risk to a larger pool. So the way insurance works, everybody pays, if you are participating in insurance, you pay a premium, which is a small monthly payment that allows you to then share risk with everybody else who has purchased a premium. If something goes wrong, that collection of money then pays out to the person who has suffered harm. In this way, insurance works as a risk transfer mechanism. It means instead of just your own self shouldering your risk, you are sharing your risk, you are transferring your risk to a larger risk pool. Insurance can be a really valuable buffer to shocks. And in this case, we're talking about crop insurance. So the shocks we're talking about are weather-related shocks. And this type of insurance, the program we're studying here, is a particular kind of insurance called index insurance. The way index insurance works is the insurance company identifies ahead of time a trigger point. For example, if the rainfall is below X, you get a payout. That number, that indexing of the trigger point is established ahead of time so that when a drought hits or a flood hits, the payout is immediate. That's how index insurance works. The program, the company we've been studying and working with in particular is Acre Rwanda. It's the Agriculture and Climate Risk Enterprise Insurance Program. And it is intended particularly for smallholder farmers. I show these photos as a way for us, those of us who are not familiar with life in rural Rwanda, to envision. These are photos I took while traveling in Rwanda to show a little bit about how hilly it is there, what a plot looks like, what the average rural home might look like. I show these photos in the US so people can understand and envision what it looks like there. So these are the type of policyholders who would participate in index-based crop insurance. This insurance program is primarily focused on droughts and floods, protecting farmers from losing their crops due to climate change-induced droughts and floods. We know that both droughts and floods are more common under climate change than they were in the past. Index insurance is one way to think about buffering that. So let's dig into this one a little bit more. How does this work in Rwanda? Well, let's remember from the crop intensification program 15 years ago, the average Rwandan household is sitting on about a third of a hectare. Very small, so very little room to expand or grow. Most of these horse families have one cow. Some of the other more wealthy families have more livestock. Almost everybody is working with rain-fed agriculture, meaning there's very little irrigation in Rwanda, in rural Rwanda. And we have a real problem in Rwanda with gaps in data. So when climate scientists are predicting how much rain to expect in the future, they do that predictions using models and data from the past. So we can say, here's how much rain there has been, and here's where we expect things to be out of the range of normal. One of the challenges that Rwanda faces is that during and immediately following the genocide, most of the weather stations, and this graphic shows you that really clearly. So you can see before the genocide, in the 80s and the 90s, there were 60 to 100 weather stations set up around the country gathering data about rainfall, wind, soil condition, and other weather components. As a result of the genocide, most of those weather stations were destroyed. And only in the last decade have they begun to be rebuilt, reestablished. So data gaps presents a real challenge in Rwanda for climate scientists to predict well what to expect, given these gaps in the historical record. There are also challenges in Rwanda with communicating climate science and climate data to rural settings. Some people who live in rural areas aren't literate, have difficulty reading or writing. They may have difficulty with access to information. They would probably have challenges understanding how to read graphs or data charts. There are some difficulty with trust. So who is the person who can share this data and this information matters a lot. Research has found, not my research, but others have found that throughout rural Rwanda, most people have an awareness that the weather has been changing. But that awareness is anecdotal. It is based only on their own lived experience or the experience of others they know personally. It does not reflect the most recent science. It does not reflect long-term or broader scale impacts. And people in rural areas have very unequal access to information. Some are very well informed and have mobile phones, for example, may have a television and have ways to gather information. Others, much less. So these are the challenges that a crop insurance program faces in Rwanda, communicating how the plan works, communicating with farmers about weather patterns and predictions so farmers can make choices about their planting patterns. So let me come back to this for 1 minute. So crop insurance as the first project, the first pilot project in this climate adaptation program, tries to understand the perspective from rural areas. What are families understanding about this crop insurance program? Does the policy, the crop insurance policy, serve to protect farmers from weather variability? Does it create a buffer from a changing climate? In other words, does crop insurance contribute to climate adaptation and therefore contribute to sustainable development by keeping farmers in production, by maintaining yield? So that's the first project. How can we understand the role of crop insurance in climate adaptation in Rwanda? Project number 2, very different element of climate adaptation. Project number 2 has to do with what we call managed retreat, and I'll explain the term as we go. So across Rwanda, there has been an effort now for many years to relocate communities that exist in high-risk areas. The target that the government of Rwanda has stated is that all of these high-risk communities will be relocated by 2020. It's 2020 right now. I don't know what the status is, but I imagine the pandemic has interfered with this goal. The idea for this policy is that relocating these communities will provide greater opportunities for people to pursue improved livelihoods. Moving these communities out of high-risk areas will give people employment opportunities, food opportunities, education opportunities, access to healthcare, etc. Allow them to improve their condition and contribute to sustainable development in Rwanda. Of course, that also means that that goal will reduce costs that the government is now paying to support these high-risk communities. Some of these communities live in areas where repeated floods happen, repeated landslides happen. I think everybody here is familiar with this pattern in Rwanda, and the government goes to great lengths. It's quite expensive for them to manage these extreme weather events and relocate communities. So here's the example that we're studying for this project is the Mazane Island example in Rwanda. That's a photo. And Mazane Island has been determined to be one of these high-risk communities, in part because it's an island with very few services. When people were living there full-time, they struggled to find clean drinking water, they didn't have electricity, there was only a primary school, no secondary school, very little health care, no access to markets. So this island was determined by the government, by the Rwandan government, to be a high-risk community. And most of the people who lived there relied on subsistence fishing for their livelihood. That was the main way that they were able to survive. So relocating people from Mazane Island is an example of climate change adaptation because the conditions there are continuing to worsen, and relocating a high-risk community to, in this case, Rweru, is an example of how managed retreat can function. So this model is called one of the many in Rwanda, as you know, many model green villages. There are several across Rwanda. Families were resituated there, moved from Mazane, put into a house in the model green village in Rweru, given a cow, and given access to all sorts of amenities, including education, healthcare, employment opportunities, training, and there were facilities, and they are back in on the mainland. But one thing that has happened is many families, we don't know exactly how many, have illegally returned to Mazane Island. So why have they done this? We think many of them rely on fishing. They know fishing. They have been fishing their whole lives, and to be moved to a village that doesn't even have a place to fish is a livelihood change that they can't do. They don't want to live this different kind of life that's being handed to them. They want to maintain the lifestyle they are used to. So this research project tries to understand those dynamics. Does managed retreat, which is a word that means moving communities out of high-risk areas into low-risk communities, how is that experienced by the people who are moving? Is that a viable climate adaptation strategy? Because remember, climate change will mean more and more of those high-risk areas become unlivable. Those risks become more intense, and it becomes more and more important for people to be able to get out of those areas. But if every time people are moved out, some return, it means something about the policy isn't working. So this is a second research project that we try to understand for adaptation. Can we work to help rural Rwandans adapt through managed retreat, or what are the factors that are hindering that effort? Project number 3. So project 1 was insurance. Project 2 is managed retreat. And project 3 is about ecotourism. As everybody knows, here in Rwanda, conservation is very tightly connected to tourism. This is a photo of me about a year ago on a guided tour of Akagera National Park, and it's a perfect example of the way tourists or visitors to Rwanda visit the country, see the beautiful parks, and contribute also to local economies and employment. So this was our guide, that is his car. So you can see all of the ways in which tourism is an economic driver in Rwanda. And in fact, Rwanda has done a very careful job of directly connecting tourism, conservation, and local economic growth. So when I went to see the gorillas in 2017, so 3 years ago, my first trip to Rwanda, I had the opportunity to go visit the mountain gorillas, and we were treated to a traditional dance performance. We donated some money to those dancers, to the guide, and we, in that way, connect tourism with conservation, with community economic growth. Those three are already bound up very closely in Rwanda. So the question is, as climate change creates impacts to particularly rural ways of life in Rwanda, farming in particular, are there opportunities in tourism that could help rural communities adapt better? So one way this might happen is through the selling of handicrafts. This is considered a tool for diversifying revenue. So a family that is relying entirely on agriculture for income faces a lot of risk when that agriculture runs into problems because of climate change. There's a flood, there's a drought, the yield is low. That family has little recourse. But if they can diversify their revenue so that their entire livelihood is not based on only agriculture, perhaps they're more adaptive and they stand to weather climate variability better. So it's an example, selling handicrafts to tourists is an example of what we call an off-farm job. It's a way to earn money, it's a way to build skills, and it's a way to grow capacity so that people are learning how to operate in a marketplace. It provides access to local and global markets. And in Rwanda, handicraft selling is done primarily by women. So it creates an opportunity particularly for women who face barriers in many other forms of employment, I think, as we all know. Here are some examples of the types of handicrafts and women selling their handicrafts. So what we are wondering is, what we are in this research project is whether selling handicrafts is a good strategy for climate adaptation. Does this create an opportunity to diversify revenue? Does it create capacity building and adaptation? So this is the third project that we will be pursuing and try to understand the perspective of women who are selling handicrafts. We hope to interview them and learn about their strategies, their challenges, and maybe some of the barriers they face. The fourth project is in some ways an overarching project that touches all of the other three, and it has to do with measuring the level of environmental awareness in rural areas around Rwanda. Our partner in this project is REMA, and REMA is seeking to understand the status of environmental awareness in certain communities. And they have asked us to do a study using what's called a CAP, knowledge, attitudes, and practices. This is a standardized survey approach based on interviewing local residents to learn what they know about climate change and the environment, what their attitudes are, in other words, how they feel about it, what they believe, what their opinions are, and then thirdly, their practices, how they behave. And the premise of this knowledge, attitudes, and practices survey is that those three are related, that people who know about the environment or about climate change will change their attitudes, and that change in attitudes results in behavior changes on the ground. So measuring CAP, measuring knowledge, attitudes, and practices, is a tool to gain insight into the status. What are the best ways for government officials to communicate with rural communities when they are implementing environmental regulation, climate change adaptation program, or other sorts of new policies? So this is the fourth project, and there are some challenges to conducting this type of research. We know that in Rwanda, the younger generation knows more English and in general has higher literacy than some of the older residents. We know also that there are language barriers everywhere. In Rwanda, we have French, we have English. So conducting these interviews and understanding knowledge and attitudes can be challenging. We also have to realize when trying to understand how people in rural areas understand the environment is that some of that is embedded and rooted in how they understand politics, history, and civics. Do they understand how the government works? Do they understand how policies are developed and implemented? Do they understand what threats exist for the environment? So some of the types of issues we will tackle. We know that conducting these kinds of interviews and surveys rely a lot on trust. If I, a white woman from the US, were to walk up to somebody in a rural area in Rwanda and begin asking them these questions, I would probably not get very far in research. So we really rely on building trust and working in partnership on the ground to gain this kind of knowledge and understanding. We also know that mobile phones across rural Rwanda are gaining status and penetration. Most people have access now to a mobile phone. If they don't have one themselves, maybe a neighbor does or a family member does. So this is another tool for reaching and communicating in rural areas. So let me share my preliminary conclusions for these projects. And of course, I had to show this image that I took, a photo of this baby gorilla, and I just love this picture, so I just had to put it up for my preliminary conclusions. So remember, this research has not yet happened. These 4 projects have been built. Local partners are working, we are working very closely with local partners to build these projects, and it is our hope that pursuing all 4 of these mini projects will create some larger knowledge and understanding about climate adaptation in Rwanda. Here's what we know already. We already know that climate change adaptation policies are changing the way people behave. Farmers are planting different crops at different times, for example. Maybe more women are practicing handicraft selling because the farm yield has become unstable. In other words, we know that already people are being moved out of Mazame Island to Ruweru. Climate change adaptation is happening, and individuals are changing the way they behave. What we seek to understand is better how those policies contribute to the way people change their behavior, and can we then learn something from these early efforts to improve the policies? So if we study the policy and we look at how it's happening around and we understand how it's understood, maybe that policy can be reformed and improved to have better outcomes on the ground. We know that adaptation happens locally at the individual and household and community level. But we know that policy making for adaptation mostly happens at the national level in Kigali. So where I seek to understand is to try to connect those 2 elements, national level policy making with local level adaptation. How can we understand the case of Rwanda? That is my talk. I'm going to stop sharing this so I can see you all again. And I think I am back now. I see there are some chats and maybe some questions. So I guess, I don't know, Daniel, you can guide me how to proceed.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Let's check if we have a couple of patients. First of all, is Dr. Ejit around? If not, I can go ahead and read the questions.
Yeah, I'm around. Yeah.
Okay, do you mind reading the questions for Lisa?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. So, Alphonse says, I usually see people translocated to model green villages, happy and proud, planting trees and so on. Thus, how do you relate the backward movement to island with climate change adaptation perspectives?
It's a great question, and this is something we hope to learn. So I look forward to interviewing and talking with people in the green villages who've had a very good experience there. Like you say, they are proud and they are really moving forward and appreciate the opportunity and are happy to have been moved. I will try to understand why their situation might be different than those who returned to Mazane. So I think you're asking, Alfonso, you're asking exactly the question that I'm asking. How can we understand why it works so well for some families and some households and not well for others? Are there ways in which the policy could be improved so more people can benefit? Or are there ways in which it serves some climate adaptation needs but is failing in other areas? So that's a great question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope that answers the questions for Alphonse. And anyone can feel free to unmute themselves if they want to ask directly their question. I would like to give the floor to Len Munir. Do you want to ask directly?
Sure. Thank you. Lisa, thank you for such a wonderful presentation. I just learned more about Rwanda in 30 minutes, and I think I've learned since I started here. Thank you. My question was, I'm looking at Rwanda's efforts to formalize workers as part of like government regulation of the workforce. And I'm just wondering, I don't want to make a wrong assumption. So what might be the relationship between climate change adaptation policies and then Rwanda's efforts at formalization of their workers? And so I'm wondering, is it wrong for me to assume that informal labor markets, you know, subsistence farmers are bad for climate change adapt policies? Or, yeah, can you just talk about that relationship?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I mean, I think this is the dynamic that we would want to understand. So whether labor markets are formal or informal, what my research would do would be try to understand what factors are driving behavior. So even an informal labor market is shift in response to climate change, right? Certain positions become available, other labor jobs become unavailable. And so even when it's formalized or not formalized, the labor market is adapting. It is responding to changes in the climate. So I guess my research would try to understand how policies, in other words, that relate to the formalization of the workforce, are there ways that policies could be crafted to maximize climate adaptation opportunities? And I think one valuable insight into that larger question is the question you raise here. Are we seeing the growth of informal labor markets? And if so, why? Why are those markets coming up? What's not available through formalized markets that an informal market arises? Are there benefits, for example, to farmers for participating in an informal market that give them more adaptive capacity? And if so, maybe we can make some policy recommendations for formalizing those workers. So I think these are really interesting questions that I think actually touch several of the main projects I described. So thanks for raising it. I know that I have a really comprehensive answer. Good question.
Okay, thank you both. Let's move to the next question, which is from Marie Laetitia Bustokie. If she's around, she's free to ask directly. Or I can go ahead and read the question. She was asking how incentive functions may contribute to improve policy development.
Yeah, I think that question is maybe asking me to clarify because I talked about incentives. So one way to think about how policies work is that good, what we call enabling policies, I think I mentioned this, enabling policies that are created in the at the national level often create incentives for people to behave in different ways. So for example, instead of saying, you must do this, we might say, if you do this, you will receive financial compensation. That's an incentive, right? That's saying, we have a new policy. If you relocate, if you agree to leave Mazane Island and move to Rueru, you will get healthcare, you will get education. Those are incentives for people to move. So understanding how these incentives function is a tool for policy analysis. Because we might say, well, the people who returned to Mazane Island did not find those incentives sufficient or compelling enough for them to change. Why not? Which incentives were missing? How could we improve the policy by creating different incentives? Is there something that could be provided in one of these model green villages that might maximize the benefits? Or we could apply the same question to any of the other projects. Crop insurance, for example. The incentive is you have to pay money to participate in an insurance program, and it's optional. So the only reason you would do that is because of an incentive. And the incentive is, if I pay this money up front, then when we have drought or a flood, I'll be covered. I'll get a payout, and I won't go hungry. That's an incentive. But understanding how those incentives are crafted and then understood help us understand how well policies work. So I think that's the connection I was trying to make between policy development and incentives. I hope that answers the question.
Good, thank you. And if Laetitia is around, she's free to keep posting some more clarifications if she needs so. So the next question is from Providence Akais, and I would like to give floor to her to ask her question.
Sorry, Daniel?
Hello. Would you like to ask your question directly, or I may go ahead and read it?
That was Laetitia speaking.
Sorry?
That's Laetitia.
Oh, okay. Is the answer given to your question okay for you?
Yeah, I just need some clarification. I want to understand if I have understood her response. So does it mean that if there is there are incentives, now it is like evaluating the impact of incentives, and then if there are still some problems, or if the incentives are not efficient, it can drive improvement of the policy in terms of incentive. Is that what is meaning?
Exactly right. Yes, I think you just said it well.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. We were moving to Providence's question. If she's around, she's free to ask the question.
Yes, so it's not really a question. I was suggesting if in the project for families that move from the island to Green Village and vice versa, so the team can identify what are the members of the family that move? Is it the man, is it the kids, is it the wife, and is it a permanent movement? That was a suggestion.
And yes, I think that's a very helpful suggestion. Thank you. And I think it's something we would try to understand, because for example, imagine if we found out that what's happening is the women and the children are relocating, but the men are moving back to continue fishing. If that is what we discovered, that would be a real insight into what's working, what's not working, and how the incentives are sort of missing the men, right? So yes, we would try to understand within families who's moving, who's not moving. Is it long-term? Is it temporary? Maybe there's a transition period. So yes, thank you for that idea.
You are welcome.
Great. Our next question is from Dr. Kalist Gatali, and he was appreciating your presentation, and he was wondering what will be your study area.
Each of these 4 projects happens in different areas. So that's part of intentionally how we built this, is so that we're gaining some insight from 4 different places in Rwanda. All of the projects are happening in rural areas. So I'm doing no research in Kigali, except I'm talking to government officials and other experts who live in Kigali. But the field research will all happen in rural areas. And we don't have final locations finalized or confirmed yet. We will have that when we get closer to the field season, which will be a few months from now. But we are going to be trying to get as much variety as possible so that we can account for differences in location. So my hope is that we'll have at least 3 of the provinces included in the study.
Yes, thank you very much. Everyone is free to keep posting their questions. The next question is from Josephat Paul, and if he's available, he can unmute himself and ask the questions.
Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Mainly focusing issue related to purely qualitative many studies which have employed or which have measured have tried to
excuse me. We are having trouble
present these outcomes. Do you get me?
Not sure. I think you have internet issues, so I may go ahead and read your questions.
Okay, you can read it for me.
Yes. Okay. He was asking, in your presentation, you indicated that the study is purely qualitative. How are you going to classify constructs with knowledge, attitudes, and perceptions qualitatively?
Yeah, this is a really good point, and you are absolutely right that the CAP survey, the Knowledge, Attitudes, and Practices survey, is quantitative. So thanks so much for pointing that out. So the survey itself is quantitative. We will be, I did not invent this survey tool. It is a widely used tool and creates quantitative results. So we learn, we can quantify levels of knowledge, components of attitudes. But the qualitative piece will be that in addition to asking the strict survey questions, we will be conducting some more open-ended survey questions at the same time, give us a fuller a source of knowledge, so that we'll be combining those quantitative results with a more qualitative interview structure. So thanks for pointing that out. I did say it's entirely qualitative, but you're right. In that 4th project, there's a strong quantitative element that we will bring in. And that creates what we call mixed methods. So hopefully we'll share some strategies and share help us learn more than just one or the other would.
Yeah, he had a second question, which is, what are the strategies ahead of identifying knowledge, attitudes, perceptions, if the findings indicate low level of participants on this?
I think what the question is asking is how will we recruit people to participate in the survey? I'm not sure. The strategies ahead of identifying low level of participants. I don't know yet. And so, as we finalize where we will be doing this CAP study, we'll be working really closely with REMA on this project. And I think REMA will help us situate this survey in a place where they can also help us have some access to people who live there who are willing to participate in this study. I'm not entirely sure how we would handle it if we found that people were unwilling to answer survey questions. We would have to sort of regroup and think about having a different person ask the questions or go to a different village, or we'd have to reconsider. My expectation is we won't have that problem. I think REMA has worked with a number of outside researchers as well as their own researchers to do this type of research in other locations. And so I feel confident that they can help pave the road for us to accomplish this work.
Yes, thank you.
Daniel,
hello, yes.
Can I say something on that?
Sure.
Yeah, I don't think we will have many problems of participants responding because Rwandans are through other surveys across the country, ATV, population census, so they are, familiar with surveys. So I don't think it will be a problem to get participants actively in the survey. But what I want to know from Lisa is, I see that now the CoEB is more focusing on climate change adaptation, but we wanted a wider, range of questions touching also environment issue related to environmental issues. So because we have been, training, we have been, implementing campaigns of environmental awareness raising, etc. So we would like, and I think this work, this research is very important for us because it will be like and to show us how far we can go to extend the survey countrywide or a more wider audience or target people. So I would like to know if other elements of environmental issues will be in the research, because this is what we would like.
Yes, thank you. I think the answer is yes, that we will be exploring broader trends in environmental awareness and attitudes to help us understand how equipped Rwandans are in rural areas to adapt to climate change by understanding more broadly how much they understand about the environment in general. So I think you're absolutely right about that.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you both. I see there is no more question in the chat. If there is anyone who would like to ask directly, they are free to ask now.
Daniel, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt, but I have another conflict scheduled for now. I think this was an hour-long talk, so I'm running out of time.
Definitely.
Okay.
I think we can conclude, and we thank you very much. And I thank all the participants and invite them for Friday's talk from Raymond. So thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, Lisa, and we hope to keep in touch.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I really enjoyed talking with all of you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.